good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you're joining in from today. Welcome to another live session at the Reactors. Before we get into the session, please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We're all here to learn, so please be respectful of other people's views, understanding of differences, and please be kind and considerate in the way you engage. The chat's going to be open throughout, and we do encourage you all to participate. Today, we have a very exciting session by Chris. It's called Hyperloop, Components and Team Now Outlook. And with that, I'm now going to add Chris to the stream, who is going to take over. Hi, Chris.
Hi there, thanks for introducing Rav, and welcome to the Microsoft Reactor. I'm really glad to be back. It's probably the longest period since I kind of spoke last time, so it's really good to return again and discuss Microsoft Teams. I've kind of missed the Reactor community, but look forward to coming back a little bit more often. So today, the session, as Rav said, is called Hyperloop, Components and Teams Now Outlook. So this is all going to look at the integration between one of Microsoft's new services, Microsoft Loop, and look how that plays out in both Teams and now Outlook. So let's kind of get in what we can expect over the course of the next kind of 50 minutes. So we're going to break down this session into three parts. First of all, we're going to have a recap about Loop. We're going to look at Microsoft's vision when it announced, and then we're going to look at what we've been able to do in Microsoft Teams over the past 9 months. We're then going to turn and switch gears and turn our kind of our notice upon Outlook. Microsoft have just released Outlook Loop components for Outlook into public preview. The third part, we're going to look at compliance, benefits, and challenges. So we're going to split this roughly down into 3 equal sections. And hopefully what you will take away today is to have a better understanding if your organization is ready to use Microsoft Loop. And if you are already, you may have noticed that, you know, there are some gaps, and we'll explore those gaps today, but there is also massive opportunities as well. So if you haven't used Microsoft Loop so far, is it the right time for your business to get engaged with this new service? This session is going to be a level 200 to 300, an intermediate session. So it will benefit if you know a little bit about Microsoft Teams and the Microsoft 365 ecosystem, or work with it every day. In terms of scope, we're going to focus purely on the Loop components, but we're also going to talk about the other 2 parts of the Microsoft Loop proposition that haven't surfaced into the market yet. In terms of demo, it's roughly about 30%. So we're going to kind of show you in both Teams and Outlook what those Loop components look like. But there is a caveat to this session, like there is with most of my sessions. So for those of you who work with Teams or work with the Microsoft 365 ecosystem, you know that we're constantly evolving. We're constantly developing new functionality, or the UX changes in slightly different ways. So this session is going to be valid for up to 6 weeks. At the end of that time, we're looking forward to Microsoft Ignite in October, and we might hear some new things then. But thank you ever so much for tuning in today, and I hope you enjoy the next kind of 45 minutes. So Microsoft Loop as a service is an app in the same way that Teams is an app, or SharePoint is an app, or Outlook is an app within Microsoft 365. And this was released back at Ignite last year in 2021, and the first service that it went into is Microsoft Teams. But we are going to go and discuss Microsoft's vision and what Microsoft announced back at Ignite. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at this video for the next minute, and then we're going to look at the 3 parts of Microsoft Loop. So I'm just going to play the video. Off we go.
Put it back together. Got my head. Put it back together. Got my head.
Okay, so that is kind of awesome. That is the kind of the video that we saw when Microsoft Loop was released at Microsoft Ignite back in November. Now we're going to deconstruct that a little bit, and we're going to kind of read through the definition of Microsoft Loop. Microsoft Loop is a new app that combines powerful and flexible canvas with portable components that stay in sync and move freely across Microsoft 365 apps. So let's just deconstruct that and break that apart and what each of kind of those sections means. When I was looking at this, I kind of made the notes on the right-hand side. You can see that we can split this paragraph in two, and really we get two key insights from that description of Microsoft Loop and what it's intended to do. So on the one hand, it's a collaborative app experience similar to the whiteboard. And in the video, what we saw is that we saw those collaborative cursors move across those Loop components in the same way that Microsoft Whiteboard does. So it's intended to be worked together from people within inside your organization. And it's intended to be shared with other people. It's a collaborative app, and this is in keeping with the story of Microsoft 365. Microsoft are releasing more and more apps that are collaborative. They're designed for people to work on them together to be able to produce something. If we think about Microsoft Lists, when that was first released, you could surface lists within Microsoft Teams almost straight away, so that many people in different departments or in kind of different locations within inside your organization can work together. If we think back to Microsoft Build, we thought about those collaborative apps that you could surface, for example, within a Teams meeting. So Microsoft Loop is going to be a collaborative app experience. It's designed for people to be able to work together. And if we look at the second half of that, portable components and syncing across Microsoft 365 apps, there's going to be items, there's going to be objects, or there's going to be entities within inside Microsoft Loop that we can surface across other Microsoft 365 apps. So that's really, really exciting. So Microsoft Loop, you're going to be able to use it in Microsoft Teams, or you're going to be able to use it in Outlook, or you're going to be able to use it in your Office applications. And that was shown in the video. If we think of that last section, it is intended to be surfaced across most of the apps within the Microsoft 365 stack. So collaborative app experience, and to be able to surface in the other apps that you already use. Let's take this a bit further. Let's actually break down into each of the three parts that Microsoft discussed when it released Microsoft Loop, because it's really important. If we understand those three components, we can understand what Loop is going to be in the future and also what it is today. So we think about Loop as being a collaborative app and being something that we can surface in other Microsoft 365 apps too. And as said, there's three kind of parts to it. The first part is what we call Loop components. Loop components are available today. You can use them right now, and you can use them in Microsoft Teams, or you can use them in Outlook that is now in public preview. Now, how we describe Loop components and what Microsoft refer to this as is atomic units of productivity used across Microsoft 365 apps. So if we think about the definition, this is what we're going to be able to surface in Teams or in Outlook. Now, what Microsoft refers to as an atomic unit of productivity is the examples that are given on the screen here. It could be a paragraph of text, it could be a table, it could be a list, a link, a date, anything on that list. And of course, I'm sure that over the next months and years, we're going to see more Loop components surface all of the time. Now, those atomic units of productivity, what Microsoft mean by that is, if you can think of it like an entity or an object that you can take and then you can put that in a chat within Microsoft Teams, or I can put it in an Office document, or I can surface that in an email. Now, in terms of where these components are stored today, they are physically stored as fluid files, so .fluid files in OneDrive. I think that the actual file name is going to change in the not too distant future. But when we think about that paragraph of text, when we think about that table, when we think about that list that we can surface in our other Microsoft 365 applications, think of them as also physically being these fluid files that sits within inside your OneDrive, within inside your personal storage. As Loop develops, we might also see them sit within inside SharePoint or other storage areas, but today they only sit in OneDrive, and I'll explain more about that over the course of the session. So we have Loop components. Let's give another example just to kind of drive it home. If I think of a Loop component as being a paragraph of text, as you can see there on the left-hand side, I can take that Loop component and I can put it into a Teams chat. If I modify the Loop component in that Teams chat, then it will modify the Loop component. But guess what? If I modify it in the Teams chat, it will also modify in email or the document or wherever it is that I have surfaced that component. It's a concept that might seem strange or alien to us at first, but we're going to demo this in a moment, and by the end of the session, you're going to get a great idea about how this works. So that's 1/3 of Microsoft Loop, but there are 2 other parts still to come. The first part is what we call Microsoft Loop Pages. Now, this is future functionality. This isn't in the market today, but Loop Pages are designed to organize our Loop components and important elements in the project. If we think about those Loop components, those paragraphs of text, those tables, the ones we discussed in the last point when discussing Loop components, we're going to be able to organize and move them around on a page very much like a whiteboard. And we're going to have those Loop components on that page together with other things such as links and files and other kind of data that might not exist today. And it's like a whiteboard experience, and we can tell this. If you look at the image here associated, you can see those collaborative cursors on the page. But you can also shift and move those components around. And you could also comment on those components as well. So these Loop pages are the flexible canvases where we can organize our Loop components. We can have a page on Loop components that are to do with marketing. We can have a Loop page on all of our Loop components that are to do with operations, and one to do with sales, and so on. This Loop pages are an organizing principle for our Loop components. The third section, which is Workspaces, brings this all together. So Workspaces allow us to group project elements together. They allow us to group the Loop pages together along with other assets to which we are working for in our project. If I was to kind of zoom in here, you can see that inside my workspace, inside my marketing Loop workspace, I have the Loop page itself, which is the project overview. And then I have lots of different assets underneath that. I have OneNote files, I have PDFs, I have other different objects that I've attached for that project. So if we could think of Workspaces being at the top level, and then within that workspace, you have pages, and organized within those pages, we have our Loop components. It operates like a pyramid. Now, in these proof of concept pictures, the one that has been provided by Microsoft for Workspaces, you can also see that there is also a Microsoft Loop app that will be on its way too. So that from a user perspective, I can open up that Loop app on my Windows 11 machine. I can then look at all the workspaces that I've got access to and that I'm working collaboratively with others. I can access all of the Loop pages within those workspaces. And then within that, I have my Loop components. And those Loop components I can surface up in the other apps within the Microsoft 365 stack. Now, this Loop client that we see right in front of us, we haven't been told much about that at the current time, but just looking at it, it looks very similar to the Microsoft Lists app, which is a progressive web app that you can kind of install straight off the browser and run on the desktop. The Microsoft List client, the progressive web app works very, very well, but we'll have to see what happens. But just from the proof of concept shots, we can see that there is a lot more still to come. 2 out of the 3 parts of Microsoft Loop are still to come in the future. Mainly, the 2 parts are there to organize our Loop components and give them a focus. So the architecture or concept is very kind of, I'm a visual learner. I find it really kind of effective to be able to see how this is going to work. And it's going to work, as you can see here. We have our loop components. They are the atomic pieces, the atomic elements that we are going to surface up through all our Microsoft 365 apps like Teams, like Outlook, like Word. Those loop components are going to be organized by loop pages. Those loop pages are going to be organized by workspaces. We are going to be able to access them through the loop app. And all of those components from a storage perspective are going to be stored in OneDrive. So we can build today an architecture, even though two parts of Microsoft Loop have not yet come to the market. Now, today, as said, we are exploring loop components in both Teams and in Outlook. At the time of release back in November 2021, it was only Teams. And within Teams, you could only surface loop components within one-to-one chats or within group chats. So basically, you could only do them in private chats, and through private chats, you could surface them within the chat within meetings as well. Now, Microsoft, over the past 9 months, have given us lots of pictures as to where Loop will surface in the future. Today, we're going to talk about Outlook. That's the first one. It has arrived in the Outlook web client. We're going to demo that today. But in the future, it's going to surface in OneNote. It's going to surface in all of the Office apps. It's going to surface in Whiteboard. It's going to even surface in Dynamics 365. And I'm sure there's other places that we haven't even heard about. So we're right at the start of the app lifecycle. It's going to be interesting few years to see where this goes and the apps that it reaches, particularly after Outlook, because we've known for a while that it's going to be surfaced in Outlook and it's going to be the next one after Microsoft Teams. So let's get straight into the demo, okay? It's demo time. For those of you who have not used loop components in Microsoft Teams, we're just going to have a short demo in order to be able to show you how we create, how we modify, and how we surface those loop components. So here I am inside our demo environment. I'm just going to switch out to Microsoft Teams, and you can see that I'm in a one-to-one with my colleague Vesku inside my environment. Here are some loop components as they look today. They've already been created in the chat, but I'm going to go on and I am going to create another one. Now, where do we start? Either in a one-to-one chat or in a group chat, it's the same place. Loop components are created right here through the loop component icon that sits below the message box. And if I'm here with Vesku right now, with inside my kind of private conversation, I will just simply click on the button for that loop component. And then I will be asked, what type of loop component do I want to create? Do I want to create a bullet list, a checklist, a numbered list, a paragraph, a table, or a task list? And I'm sure that the types of loop components that you get are going to grow over time. And I'll explain why that is in later on in the session. But I'm going to create a bullet list. So you can see it then creates the basis of the loop component. And I'm about to add a title. So I'm going to add this title to this loop component. I'm going to call it Reactor Bullet 1, Reactor Bullet List 1. And then I will create some items on there. So item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4. And then I'm going to post that into the chat. So there we go. The loop component has now been created in the Teams chat. But that isn't the only place that it creates. It also creates within office.com. So if I was to click on this loop link here, it's going to open up a new tab within my browser, and you can see our regular view of office.com. It's going to create it there as well. Now, this is a one-to-one conversation that I'm having with Vesku. If I was to open another page, and now here I am logged in as Vesku, look, you can see there I'm now collaborating. If I was to add something as Vesku to the loop component, so I'm going to add a new item. There we go. That's saved to the new item. That is going to update, okay, if it were in real time. So I'm just going to kind of switch out and then switch back. So it's syncing. You can see, it's just waiting for it to load up. Okay. So there's item 5. You can see that Vescu's there. It's taken a little bit of time to update, but that basically that Vesa, when Vesa has updated that and added an extra item on that loop component. So, oh, there we go. That would explain why I'm typing in the wrong one. So let me go and get the one that I've just created. Do that again. I'm going to put in item 5. There we go. Switch back out. Look, there we go. You can see that that's automatically updated in office.com and automatically updated the loop component in the Teams client. Loop components are based on something called the Fluid Framework, which updates in almost real time. So you can see that we can modify loop components on the fly, anyone who has access to them. So I've created this loop component in a chat with Vescu. If he or I moderate, or modify this loop component, that is going to change. Let me create one within a group chat. So here I am within the group chat. I click on my loop component. I put on the bullet list. I'm going to call this reactor bullet 2, item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4. I'm going to post that into the group chat. Again, this will also be created on office.com, not just in the Teams client. And within this group chat, Vescu and Adam are both members of this. So if I switch out again, you can see that in Teams for Vescu, if I click on the top, you can see here that Chris has created. I'm now modifying that. That loop component has now been updated by Vescu. But in addition, if Adam updated it, that will update the loop component in real time. So loop components give us, right, the ability to start working on these collaborative objects in real time with other people throughout our organization. Imagine that we could put together these bullet lists or put together these tables, and then we can surface them in the apps that we use. This is potentially going to revolutionize in many ways what it is that we do, because we can work on these things in real time. We could simply, for example, copy and paste them, put them somewhere, or even better, when it's fully supported, bring them into the app that we use. If I could just suddenly take this list and say I had to use this list several times during a day or during a week, rather than having to write that out every time, I could simply surface that in an app that I use. This could be very, very powerful for us. Now, in terms to surface it in another app or surface it in another conversation, here's where the magic works, right? Okay, so we've shown you how to create a loop component, how we can modify that if we can access that loop component, but I'm going to show you how I can surface it in another conversation. So imagine I've now got a new conversation in Microsoft Teams and I'm working with Adam within inside this, so not Vescu. Hi, Adam. Here we go. So I've just started a conversation with Adam with inside my organization. Here's a loop component that I'm working on with Vescu. But let's say, right, I want to do something else with Adam using the same loop component. What I would do is I would copy the loop component link that's right here at the top right-hand side of the loop component. And then what I would do, watch this, is I'm going to copy this into the chat box in the conversation that I'm having with Adam. It's going to surface that loop component and I'm going to post it. And by posting that message and bringing the loop component into this conversation, I am now giving Adam the permission in order to be able to work on it. And Adam can then modify this in real time. So that is how we can surface. We take this link up the right-hand side of the loop component. We then use the link and drop the link into the app. And if it's supported by the app, then the loop component is going to render. So that's awesome, right? Okay. Now, some of the other things that we can do, I'm just going to show you because we haven't got time to do all of these, but pinning and searching is really, really important. So in terms of pinning these apps, if we've got, and we're using loop components within kind of chats and conversations, we're going to chat with people in that conversation. And then the way that it is in Teams, it's going to, we could maybe struggle to find it. However, if I'm here in my group chat, what I can do with this loop component is I can pick to the top of the screen. So if I hover over the loop component, I click on the 3 buttons, I then pin, and I will pin the loop component to the actual top of the chat to make it easily accessible. I click on that, the chat is going to go straight to the loop component. What I can also do to make loop components easily accessible to me personally is also, if I click 3 buttons here, I can also save the message as well. And then if I'm going back and I'm looking at my saved messages, you can see that I've got access to the loop components that I'm currently using. In addition, we can also, if we click the 3 dots on the loop component and we go to more actions, we can also put the loop components into tasks as well, but they don't render like you see them, but it does put the link into a task. That can be something that we do in order to easily access them as well. But important to understand at this point, okay, we can easily create loop components. We can put them into one-on-one in chats or into group chats. We can then collaboratively work on that loop component. These also surface within office.com, and which we can also share links with others there too. We can pin them. We can also save them. In terms of searching for them, there is no kind of great way in order to search for them through the app. We can potentially look through them through search. So for, when the search is indexed and stuff, so if we come back a couple of days later and put in the name of the loop component, it will surface. But the optimal way to find loop components, particularly ones that we use and we have access to, is to go to office.com. So on office.com, if I go to the home screen, okay, and I go to my content, you will be able to see the loop components there. I think if you even do a filter, you can filter it on the loop components that you've got access to within inside your environment. As said, they are stored within OneDrive, so you can also look there too. So if I click on my OneDrive and I click in Microsoft Teams chat files, the loop components that I created within Teams are going to be housed there. So that is just a short demo of how we use loop components today within Microsoft Teams. Now, the prerequisites for loop components in Teams are as follows. Firstly, our users need to have a SharePoint license because it's SharePoint that ultimately controls the loop components. And you can enable or disable loop components via PowerShell. To see if loop components are enabled or disabled, you would use the get-spo tenant command. To be able to turn them on and off, you would use the set spo tenant is loop enabled, and you would set that to true or you would set that to false. Now, just to be warning and to be wary is that this is an on and off switch. You can't granulate it further than that. Components are either on or they're either off. Now, that's going to have to be a consideration as to whether you introduce them into your business at this time. I'll explain that as we kind of get on into the session. In addition to having the SharePoint license, okay, we need to make sure that we can both have that SharePoint license and access OneDrive, because OneDrive is where the fluid files, where they're actually stored. Those components are stored, whether it's in Teams or whether you create them in Outlook, they're all stored today within OneDrive. But OneDrive itself is based upon the assignment of the SharePoint license. So that's why it kind of says SharePoint Online license in two places. Third, if we're going to use them in Teams, we need to have a Teams license, and we're going to need to have a Teams client as well. So you can do them today. I've just shown you in the web experience. You can also use them in a desktop experience, and you can also use them in the mobile experience. And from, we've seen and heard, although this would need to be validated, you should be able to use them in the Linux and the VDI. So if you're using Azure Virtual Desktop, the version of Teams on that, you should be able to use it there as well. But desktop, web, mobile, absolutely, I use them every day on all three of those clients. But I would, like I say, I'm basing off verified information for the Linux and the VDI. So those are the prerequisites. But showing you the amazing things that we can do. We can collaborate on these atomic components. We can add them into our Teams conversations. We can use them within Teams meetings. What are the limits? What are the kind of drawbacks? Where are the gaps that we can identify? And the first big one is in terms of our use case. We can only still use them within private chats. We can't actually use them within Teams channel conversations today, so we can't use them in all of the areas of Teams where we collaborate with others. So we can't use them in what we consider to be the two sides, of Microsoft Teams, the private and in terms of the Teams. We can only just use them in the private chat section. And on that private chat section, we can't use them in federated chats. We can't use them in conversations we have with people outside of our own organization today. Because if we were talking to somebody in another organization and we kind of rendered a loop component into that, they wouldn't see it. So there is a limited use case. We can only use loop components inside the organization, and we can only use them in private and group chats. We can't use them in Teams where we work with other people, and that is a drawback. Secondly, in terms of the fluid file, that's stored. That's not even stored in a top level of OneDrive. That's stored one folder section down. If I just jump back into OneDrive for a second, you can see here I've created two loop components, one in a one-to-one chat, one in a group chat, and they are created in Microsoft Teams chat files. Now we have to think that in Microsoft Teams chat files, in that folder, everything else that we use in private chat, so for example, attachments, are going to be stored here as well. What I mean and why it's important is that loop components are not stored within their own dedicated folder. This could be a very, very busy folder in some people's OneDrives. It might be hard to spot the fluid files there, but there is further impact, because as I will show you, when you create them in Outlook, they're in a different folder completely from this, and that raises implications. Now, moving a fluid file outside of OneDrive is going to break the loop component. So you think, oh, maybe I can get around this by taking that fluid file and putting it in SharePoint. That won't work. It won't render. But what you can do is you can move those fluid files between folders. So like Teams recordings, if you wanted to create your own dedicated loop component folder within OneDrive and move your loop components there, they will still render. There are some other ancillary concerns as well. We can't create our loop components in office.com. So whilst we have the access to the canvas and we can make changes here. So let me put kind of a new item here. Okay. Item 6. So if here at office.com and we go back to that one-to-one conversation, There we go. So you can see that that new item 6 has been created. That will change the loop component in whatever app that loop component has been surfaced. We cannot create the loop components today through office.com. So in other words, we haven't got one centralized place that we can create. We can either create them in Teams, we can create them in Outlook, but we cannot create them from one singular place should we want to. Last but not least, loop components do not support HTML and Markdown. There is some basic formatting, but it's not as rich as other formatting that we have in general conversations within Teams or within emails. So that's a gap, that's an opportunity gap there too. One of the big things, or one of the pluses, is because we can move fluid files around within OneDrive, okay, and because they're housed within OneDrive, people like Open and myself have been playing about with this in Power Automate. So we've been trying to use loop components with Power Automate because there's several different loop cases. Imagine that I created a flow, and that flow pushed a loop component into a group chat every single week at a scheduled time. We could review that loop component on a regular basis. What happens if we wanted to push it a table to use to another place in our organization with a flow button? That is all potentially possible because we can use loop components in Power Automate. Let me show you what I mean. So here I am back in my environment. I'm going to jump into Power Automate, and you can see that I've got a very basic scheduled flow here. Okay, so let me just go and select edit and go and jump into the flow. I've got a trigger and I've got an action, and then we've got a recurrence trigger, and we got an action to post the loop component into Microsoft Teams. Now that runs as said on a schedule. Now I'm just going to test this and trigger this today manually so that you can see what I mean. So it's going to be within a group chat, and within, let's just get to the associated group chat. It's going to surface here. So I'm just going to jump into flow. I'm going to click test. There we go. So, run that flow. The flow successfully started. That's going to be, there we go. You can see that the flow is running because I've kicked it off manually, and now that's been completed. And there we go. But you're going to say, what? That doesn't look right. That doesn't look like a loop component. That is the loop component link. So if I just literally copy and then paste that into the conversation, boom, I've got my loop component ready to go. So it does, in a sense, it doesn't render, but you can use loop components with Power Automate in order to be able to surface in chats and group conversations. But we have to be mindful of that limit. Flows do not currently render the component link, but I can deliver the component link, and then you can copy the component link and then render the loop component. And we have to then be aware, if we're using them with Power Automate, about those two different types of links. They're different. The component link of a loop component is here at the right hand side. The office.com, the link that kind of directs you to the office.com version of the loop component, is here, is this hyperlink here. If I was to click that, look, it goes to office.com. So we have to be aware of what link we're actually using within our flows. So this is very promising, because whilst it means it doesn't render today, myself and several others have fed back to the Power Automate team. I think something good in the nearer rather than the further future. So when it does render, imagine that we can trigger these loop components in several different applications based upon automation. I mean, that is, a kind of world and things that we've dreamed about doing for many, many years since we've got these services. So what about loop components in Outlook? It's a very similar experience. We're now going to jump into Microsoft Outlook. Here I am inside my Outlook environment. And as you can see, within the web, the loop component is there. So if I have my loop component, I can create a loop component completely from here within my email. And it's exactly the same process. So add a title. So I'm going to call this, Reactor, and I then have my items. Item one, item two. And then what I would do is that once I've done that, I would build up other parts. So hi, Vesku, Chris. That loop component would form part of my email. But imagine if we could surface up these loop components in our email. Imagine if I didn't have to copy and paste a table. I just simply dropped in a URL and then it rendered the table within my email. I'm going to send that to Vesku. Off I go. Okay. Do I want to send this message without a subject? Yes, I'm just going to send it. But here we go. Okay. If I take the loop component from Teams, so I'm just going to take the loop component from Teams, and I then drag and drop it into Outlook, but because it supports that fluid file, it's going to render that loop component. So you can see how easy it is for me to be able to move loop components across the apps that I use inside my environment. That's awesome. You've just looked at me demonstrating how Outlook and Teams can interoperate with loop components. Now, in terms of prerequisites for Outlook, you need an Exchange Online license and you need to have Outlook for the web enabled. But in this public preview today, it is only Outlook for the web that's supported. So you can see there's a limited use case here. The desktop, the mobile, the client on Linux or VDI, they're not supported today. They will be in the future, but we're still some way to go. And we have to think, there's a lot of people that use the client on the actual local machine as opposed to the web version, and there's loads of people that use mobile. If you try to use it, like let's say I create it in the web and then look at the desktop or look at the mobile, it will not render as that loop component. It will just render as a short link. So if we're using the 3 clients instead of just using the 1, it could look a bit disjointed for us. And very much like Teams, the use cases are limited. It doesn't work outside of the org. It can only be used in one of the Outlook clients today. We have to think about that in an organization and how people use Outlook, because many of them do use the desktop client and many of them do use the mobile client. In terms of the fluid file, that's actually stored in a different folder completely within inside OneDrive. So if I go to that I've just created, that's done in the attachments folder. Now that's quite problematic, because what it means is that if we're using apps and our loop components are stored in different folders, that could potentially make it very, very confusing and difficult to manage too. In terms of creation and code, same as Microsoft Teams. Can't create in office.com. We can only create in the app that we're using the loop component with. So Outlook, like Teams, and it doesn't support HTML or Markdown. In terms of the interop between Teams and Outlook, you saw me seamlessly move or copy the link from Teams into Outlook, and it also works vice versa. But we have to ask this question: are people going to be happy copying and pasting links in order to be able to use these loop components? Would they rather a button to make it a smoother interoperability and transition between one app and another? Because people already, for example, in an organization, users complain about doing copying and pasting, and that's what you're doing. You're copying a link and you're putting the link into another app. If you're working with a dozen loop components a day, can you imagine the amount of copying and pasting links that you would do between an app? Also, as well, Teams and Outlook have this ability called Share to Teams and Share to Outlook. Here is my loop component. If I was to click on these 3 little buttons, I can say, you saw it just there, Share to Outlook. That pushes, the Teams message into Outlook. But if I was to do that, the loop component doesn't render doing this, and the same vice versa to do this in Outlook. So the kind of the interoperability, the features that allow that interoperability today to very easily push from Teams to Outlook or Outlook to Teams do not support loop components either. Okay, I'm just going to come out of this. Oh, there we go. It has rendered. Look, it doesn't render. It just literally puts a link in there, and that link isn't the loop component. That link goes to office.com. Now, finishing off as we close this session, we look on the kind of the third, which is compliance, benefits, challenges, and insights, because it's not just how loop components operates in each of these different apps or how they kind of interoperate together. But if we're going to introduce these into the environment, we've got to have some other considerations, and one of them is compliance. We have regulations as an organization to meet. Will loop components, given what we now know, does it work within inside Microsoft 365? Does it fulfill, the compliance regulations for our organization? Now, in terms of retention, because loop components are stored within OneDrive, then retention policies and labels are both supported. You can have a retention policy to OneDrive, and the loop components, the fluid files, would adhere to that. You can attach retention labels to fluid files themselves. Components also have a version history. If we just kind of jump up into OneDrive and I was to select one of those loop components, the three buttons, you can see that I've got a version history, and I can go back and restore a previous version before changes have been made. So it's quite, it's more mature, shall we say, in the retention area. In terms of search, I think kudos goes to Tony Redmond in this area. Content search in Microsoft 365 does pick up loop components. You cannot see into those loop components. So in other words, they will work in content search, and so they will work in e-discovery, but you cannot see what's inside that file itself. So that's a big drawback. So whilst we can kind of hone in, we can't look. Now, it has some gaps in the area of compliance, and this might stop loop components being kind of embraced within organizations straight away. Number one, you can't apply sensitivity labels to fluid files and hence loop components. That's going to be bad. If it contains sensitive information, then it could be through loop components. The same with data loss prevention. If somebody stuffed credit card data into a loop component and sent it to somebody else, then our data loss prevention policy would not capture that at this current time. Now, when apps are introduced into Microsoft 365, they usually go into security and compliance functionality over time. So I would expect that we will at some point, but of course, I can't, kind of promise that. We will have to see how the situation develops. So in terms of the benefits and challenges of Microsoft Loop components at this current time, we can create them and collaborate in the flow of our work. We can use these atomic units of productivity and surface them into the apps that we use. We can use them in Teams today with inside private chats and group chats. We can use them in the web of Outlook. Given time, they're going to roll out to many of the applications. They're going to roll out to OneNote. They're going to roll out to all the clients in Outlook. They're going to roll out to the Office applications. They're going to roll out into Dynamics 365. Imagine the power that we could surface a table or a list or a Q&A component. Imagine that we can do that, and we've already written all that stuff out before, and we can just surface. Imagine when we begin to build documents based upon loop components that saves us time. That means is that we're going to have assets at our fingertips that we can surface in any of the apps that we can do in the flow of our work. The same content can exist and be surfaced in multiple apps, and people can work on them live in real time. It's going to give us a structure for our assets. Imagine a marketing department that has all these atomic units that can be used for building their marketing campaigns, all housed within Loop pages, within their Loop workspaces, within their Loop app. It's very, very powerful in terms of how we'll be able to structure this going forward. So Loop is going to give people structured assets to be able to bring up in the flow of our work. But the challenges are this. Number one, it's going to involve a new way of working and a new thinking about how we can surface assets. There's going to need to be some adoption. In addition, one of the pain points is management. Pages and workspaces are not there yet, so we can't organize those Loop components, and those Loop components are stored in separate places inside our personal storage. That's going to be a problem for some people. So it's not the full experience. It's not going to be here for some time. It's taken 9 months from kind of being released into Teams to being released into Outlook. Last but not least, Loop lacks compliance functionality. There's going to be some organizations that say that we're going to have to turn off Loop components because they don't work with things like sensitivity and DLP. It's early on in the app lifecycle. It's in play. So they might think, this is a brilliant vision. We like the kind of where it is at this moment and the route that it's going. But for us to actively use it in our production environment, it might take another 6 months or a year in order to be able to implement. Insights from using it over the past, kind of 9 months is this. Using Loop applications is a different way of working. We would recommend some testing in a testing environment and have the stakeholders involved, because they will need to support users, very much like using SharePoint or using Microsoft Teams. The IT team can train up champions, the champions can train the staff, but there needs to be a testing environment to have the main stakeholders and get used to that way of working. In addition, it's recommended that training will be provided. An hour such as this and understanding what Loop components are and how they act and what the limits are is useful to get up to speed in order to set expectations. Know that this is an app that's going to, certain functionalities are going to be there, but they're going to be there in the future. Third is all about the tracking. We need to know how we can find the Loop components that we are going to work with. So remember, office.com content, we can see all the Loop components that we have access to, whether we house them in our OneDrive because we own the file, or whether we have permissions on another Loop component that is stored in a co-worker's OneDrive. We can also filter that based upon Loop components. We can also use it within the search in Microsoft Teams, but it needs to be indexed. It's not going to appear straight away after we've created the Loop component. We can also find it if we pin them to the top of the conversations, and if we look at our saved in Microsoft Teams, that is also a good way to find them. But users, to be able to use them effectively, know they can go to and where the Loop component is going to be. Last but not least, we have this idea of translation. We need to figure out the use cases inside our organization and find out where it works and where it doesn't. It's not going to be a replacement for email. It's not going to be a replacement for instant messages within Microsoft Teams. It is designed with these Loop components to be atomic units of productivity that we can surface and work on collaboratively and then use inside our applications, whether that today is mail and whether that, or messages or chats within Teams, years time or 2 years time. That's also going to be within documents within our Office apps. That's also going to probably be within records inside Dynamics 365, and that's going to be in our notes for OneDrive. So we think about the notes that we use within Teams meetings, or when we use them on a day-to-day basis for our personal focused work. So returning to the outcome, I think we've just about got time for any questions at the end of the session. But to wrap up, we've looked at the vision of Microsoft Loop, and we've broken down Loop into 3 parts: Loop components, pages, and workspaces. Only one of three of those parts of Loop are here today with us. We've looked at Loop components in Teams. We got hands-on and looked how we created them, how we modify them, how we surface them. We've looked at how we pin them, how we search for them. We look at how we can use Power Automate with them. That's an exciting development area. We then, in the second part of the session, looked at Loop components in Outlook. The experience is very similar. We've got to hand it to the team. It's consistent across Outlook and Teams, but there's also limits in Outlook like there is in Teams. We can't use it in all of the Outlook clients today. When we take both of these things together, we also have to kind of also take into account compliance, the all-up benefits and challenges. So I hope the outcome of this session is that you now have a better understanding of where Microsoft Loop is today, where it's going, and if your organization is ready to use it, if you're not using it already, maybe it's a good time to start. Maybe you want to hold off. Maybe you want to disable them in SharePoint for another couple of months and wait till it hits that, or whether you can share them externally outside of your organization, or whether you can use them, for example, within Teams channels and conversations. This was a level 200, an intermediate session. We focused purely, or for the majority of it, on Loop components, but we did look at the other parts and that wider kind of Loop vision. The demo was roughly around 30%, and like I say, it's valid up to 4 to 6 weeks. Maybe we'll hear a bit more from Microsoft Ignite, but I hope we do. I hope we hear about where we're going in Outlook and bringing it to those new apps, kind of apps, or should I say the new clients, and moving it into new apps such as OneNote or something else. This is going to be an exciting journey. We're here early days. I'm sure it's something that we're going to be a big part of our future. So well done to Microsoft and the team, and great progress on where they are today. In terms of what's next for me, you can catch me in other conferences all over the autumn, but I want just to thank everyone for attending today.
Hi, Chris. We have some questions. I will display them on the screen so you'll be able to read them. So first one, here it goes.
Okay, so let me just kind of get to the screen. I might create an effect, because obviously we use it.
Yeah, I can. I've shared my screen, so now you can have a look at the screen.
Okay, perfect. Let's have a look. So is this is in the comment section?
Yes.
We're looking at the conversation from Mike. So if a component only exists in OneDrive, this is not good for business continuity. When a user leaves, the user's OneDrive is removed. I mean, that's certainly a risk. So that has been identified. If we're putting stuff within personal storage, the question naturally kind of comes to bear is that why has this not been designed to go into storage such as SharePoint, for example, that it's not linked to a personal user? There has also been questions of Microsoft in terms of compliance. Do you want things that can have sensitive information, such as Loop components, to be in personal kind of mail, kind of personal storage? As you say, if the person leaves. Now, as part of the leaving process, you can move over OneDrive and assets and assign it to somebody else within inside the organization. So that is possible today. You can also, of course, restore, if you delete, but you always are going to run the risk of a user is going to be offboarded, their license is going to be removed. Somebody's not going to question this, then you're going to want that Loop component, and then you're going to realize that user was deleted, and you're not going to be able to get it back. So that is a risk today. But as said, you can have kind of retention policies as well. So if you have retention policies on, they will be consistent through that. Microsoft, kind of when asked in terms of are they going to surface it in storage other than OneDrive, they basically said, look, we can't confirm or deny, but, I think they are thinking about this, because certainly the MVPs and the technical community have fed this back. So I think that's an excellent question. So thank you ever so much. Okay, not sure if I see a lot of value in this right now. Very limited use cases. I use desktop apps all day, not online apps. Do you know what, John? Thank you ever so much for that. I really appreciate it. That's why it was called Hyperloop this session, because we have to think is that are we far enough along in the app development, kind of life cycle that it is going to be really useful for our organization to use. Now, for some people who use kind of private chats, or they use the Outlook web app, or they're all in on the latest technology and how to use it, they're going to be all in on this. But if I'm looking at this from a very pragmatic perspective, if you're a regular user in a business who tend to use desktop clients or use mobile apps, this doesn't render in kind of not in Outlook. In Teams it does, but not in Outlook. And lots of people spend time in Outlook. It's not there in OneNote today. It's not there in the Office apps today. What value is this going to bring to people's kind of practical life? And until it starts kind of rolling out more widely into clients and into other applications of the Microsoft 365 stack, is it far enough along to be useful for our business today? Now, this is an on-off switch. Anyone can essentially start using loop components if it's turned on inside your environments. You have to make the decision, or two decisions. Number one, do we start using it? Do we commit to it? Are we ready for it? Is it useful enough for us today? If it's yes, then of course, we begin a program of start and educated in how to use this properly. If not, then you might want to decide to disable it at the SharePoint level so it doesn't appear in any of the applications until you've tested it inside your test environment and you think, well, now it's got to the point where I can introduce it because most people will be able to use it and we will have enough valuable use cases. So that's why it's called Hyperloop. We're at that stage. Is it still hype? Or are we at a point where it then becomes, kind of useful and valuable for us to put it into the wild? Thank you ever so much.
And sorry, just to follow on, I think Mikey's question, as he asked, any ETA on the compliance issue?
Unfortunately not. When we talked about kind of sensitivity labels or DLP, you can go on today to the Microsoft 365 roadmap. You can put in Loop, for example, or Microsoft Loop, and those items are not up there. There is no ETA on when those, for example, are going to be fixed. If your organization will kind of interpret the housing of the fluid files within inside OneDrive as being a compliance issue in itself, I don't know whether Microsoft are going to potentially look to change course and, let's say, house it in SharePoint within the future. I mean, I'm thinking about another app like Microsoft Lists, right? Okay, you have the ability to create a list with inside SharePoint or with inside OneDrive through personal lists, but you can disable the personal parts so you can only create lists in OneDrive. Maybe one day we'll have a situation like that. Maybe they'll get the feedback. But in terms of introducing it into the other compliance areas, such as sensitivity labels and data loss prevention, there is no kind of word on that at this moment in time. You can, however, feedback at feedbackportal.microsoft.com. That's got all the Microsoft products on there, and you can feed it either under Microsoft Loop if that exists, it under Teams and Outlook. Today, there are several feedbacks that I raised on Loop components that you can see in the Teams area. So, we need to be vocal about this to Microsoft and say, look, this is something we need. If you want us to use this, then, it's got to tick the boxes, particularly in a security, compliance, and identity perspective. Thank you.
I think that were all the questions from the audience. And thank you very much, Chris, for your time.
No worries. I hope everyone enjoyed the session. It's going to be interesting to see where we go. I'm personally a big believer that this is going to turn into, kind of an amazing application when we see it in its entirety and we've got pages and workspaces. I think that it's a big future, but I know that I'm an evangelist and I love Microsoft technology and I like just to be hands-on with it all. So whilst it's okay for me today, it might not be for you. So is it hype, or are we starting to see the value? I think that's going to be shifting over time, depending upon where we are and what we need to do. But thank you ever so much for coming. I really appreciate you spending the time with me here today.